to a blank screen, but I'm John Deering, leader of Kenilworth Town Council, and it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to this webinar on electric cars. The webinar is an event organised by the Town Council's Climate Emergency Group, which is a collection of local residents and cross-party councillors who have designed a roadmap of actions in Kenilworth that will help the town's residents, businesses and organisations address climate change. Before we start, I'm required to give the disclaimer that the views expressed in this talk are not necessarily those of the Town Council. We are recording the event so that people can watch later, but in line with data protection legislation, further video recording of the meeting is forbidden unless it is for your own use only, which should then be erased when your purpose for recording has expired. Full details of the Kenilworth Climate Roadmap and also our policy for online conferencing are downloadable from the Town Council website. But I would now like to hand over to George Martin, who is a member of that roadmap group, to chair the rest of the session. George, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, John, and good morning, everyone. So I'm not a town councillor, but I am part of the working group, as John explained, and I'm also passionate about the environment and in particular reduction of carbon. We have within the UK the government's 10-point plan that came out recently, and of course our Prime Minister announced that our target is now going to be for a 68% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions by 2030, which is ambitious and great to hear. And this all fits into the roadmap that John described from the Town Council, and also the climate emergency action plans that both Warwick District Council have and Warwickshire County Council have. So it gives me, so I'm going to chair the meeting today and this morning, and I'll then be looking at the various questions that come in from you, and when Euan has finished doing his presentation, I will then set these questions. So I'd like to now introduce Euan. So Dr Euan McTurk is currently working from his office at home in Inverkeithing. And for people that don't know exactly where Inverkeithing is, it's near the Forth Bridge. So it's just sort of a little bit northwest of Edinburgh. And Euan describes the weather looking out of his window today as dreich. If you need a description of that, I'm sure Euan will be happy to explain. So Euan is a consultant battery electrochemist who's been working and driving electric vehicles since 2009, so more than 11 years. Euan has worked on next generation lithium cell chemistries during his PhD at the University of Oxford. He operated on the Tesla cells to insert sensors in them to assess their true maximum performance when he worked at the Warwick Manufacturing Group at Warwick University. And he's built up a state-of-the-art battery test facility in Edinburgh. Euan is also the creator of the YouTube series Plug Life Television. He'll explain more about that during his presentation. And this explains the complex battery electrochemistry in a way that everyone can understand, demonstrates how it's feasible for entire nations to electrify their transport, and he will bust several myths about electric vehicles. Euan recently founded Plug Life Consulting, which provides expertise on battery electrochemistry, electric vehicles, electric storage systems, and charging infrastructure to industry, academia, business, and government. Euan, can I hand over to you for your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, George. Thank you for having us today. So you should hopefully be able to see my presentation now. There we go. All good? Yep. Perfect. Right. So, yeah, again, thank you for the introduction, George. Today, I'm going to be sharing my experience of how I got into EVs and how I've found them to be, both in terms of technical practicality, but also the financial aspects as well. And we'll be, as was mentioned, we'll be looking at some of the common myths about electric vehicles. We'll try and get through as many as we can within the time, and ultimately, you'll wish you'd bought one sooner. So I've already had a very generous introduction from George there, so you can read all of this at your leisure. But probably the important thing from the point of view of this presentation is that during my time at WMG, I was a resident of Kenilworth, which is a fantastic town. I really enjoyed my time in Kenilworth. The town, the amenities, the people. And it's just such a fantastic community. I really enjoyed my time there. It was only a year that I actually lived in Kenilworth, but as I said, it was fantastic. And also just the level of ambition within the town council and within the sort of more kind of green aspects. Now it would appear that my presentation is on an automatic timer, which I hadn't realised. But this is my first electric vehicle, which is a Peugeot 106 electric, which I stumbled across by accident at the University of Dundee when I was going to do my honours project. I was trying to decide what to do. I was doing an applied physics degree called renewable energy, and I was trying to decide what I wanted to do for my project. And this literally pulled up next to me one day. The university just got their hands on it. It's a very rare beast to be a fully electric Peugeot 106. So it was one of only 20 in the UK at the time. I think there were about 10,000 electric vehicles produced by Peugeot and Citroën between the mid-1990s and 2005. Only a handful of those made it to the UK. So let's have a look at the tech specs for a machine from 1999. So this was a 20 kilowatt motor, which is 27 horsepower, which doesn't sound like much, but actually that was capable of scalping quite a lot of vehicles, like your white van men and taxi drivers off the line, because the torque, the ability to put its power down, meant you had instant acceleration. So it was actually quite a nippy machine despite its lack of power. The battery pack was nickel cadmium. You don't even get nickel cadmium batteries anymore because of the cadmium content. And they had certain maintenance implications. You had to top them up with deionized water every now and again. And the capacity was only 12 kilowatt hours, which is half that of the entry-level Nissan Leaf from when the Leaf first came out. So the range was only about 50 miles per charge. The 0 to 60, yes, that's what it was electronically limited to. So, it could technically have gone faster, but they decided to limit it anyway. The charging socket was quite unusual. It was a Marshall connection. So it was actually, you charge it up using a 3-pin plug. I plugged it into a garage, or wherever I could find, just a typical outlet. But this bit on the right that's actually in the car is like a kind of flappy, paddly thing. That's the Marshall connector. So that predates any modern format of charging infrastructure. So that's not what you would get on a modern electric vehicle. It was very much, ahead of its time, and it was like older formats that you don't get anymore. The recharging time off of that 3-pin plug was 6 hours, which was fine because I would recharge that overnight. And actually, I ended up buying that car off of the University of Dundee, having done my honours and master's project. Oh yeah, something else I forgot to mention. It also has the best interior of any vehicle I've ever owned. Those tartan seats are legendary. I still miss having that. In the car that I'm driving today. So it actually had quite an eventful history, this car. It was used in my honours and master's projects where I kind of benchmarked the capability of the machine and then did a review on next generation battery chemistries to see how that would improve the performance of the vehicle. That was also featured in several news articles, and at a conference I managed to physically drive that car inside one of the University of Dundee's main buildings. It was a tight fit, and you certainly couldn't do that with a modern car. They've got a lot bigger since then. One of the most impressive things about electric vehicles in general, particularly this one, which takes what is a very basic drivetrain and makes it even more basic because it's an earlier piece of tech. I drove that around in the middle of a freezing cold winter with a dead auxiliary battery, the lead acid battery that every car has to do the wipers, the radio, that kind of thing, for 2 weeks before I could be bothered risking frostbite on my fingers to change that battery, because all I lost was remote central lock-in. As soon as you put your key into the ignition, well, it's not really ignition anymore, but you know what I mean, you would hear the DC to DC converter clicking in, and that's taking power from the traction battery, the big NiCad battery, and feeding it through to the 12-volt systems to do your wipers, your headlights and stuff. So the car was able to revive itself. If it was a petrol or a diesel car, it would have been dead. You wouldn't have been able to start it. So this was an indestructible little car that just refused to die. It survived the great fuel crisis of 2012 when everyone else was queuing up for the pumps, and incidentally spawned a meme which spawned the idea for the title of my YouTube channel, Plug Life Television. So yeah, that was that little car has not only launched my career but also launched my YouTube channel pretty much. So I ended up upgrading this car to lithium-ion batteries to get an extra range out of it. It was a Tesco value attempt at a lithium-ion battery pack. It could have easily done over 100 miles per charge with the batteries that were available at the time. And with the batteries that are available today, yeah, you could probably shoehorn 150, 200 miles range into that little car. But, with the stuff that was available, particularly bearing in mind I was still a student, I just put in a kind of lightweight battery pack to do 70 miles per charge, which was more than enough. I put in a digital dashboard as well, and also upgraded it so you could use it with modern charge points. As you can see, that is a fairly modern charge point that it's plugged into in the photo there next to what at the time was a brand new Outlander. And it's now on display at Dundee Museum of Transport as part of their Future of Transport exhibit, where they look at the evolution of low carbon transport and electric vehicles and where that might be heading. I've since upgraded to something a bit more contemporary. So I decided to get my hands on a Nissan Leaf. This is a 24 kilowatt hour Nissan Leaf, entry level specification battery wise, but this is one of the ones that was built in Sunderland. So it's a 2014 Leaf. And that is my 106 electric arriving at Dundee Museum of Transport to be put on display. So let's compare the tech specs of a 1999 EV versus a 2014 EV. So there's a quadrupling in motor power. There's at this point, the battery pack had gone from 12 to 18 kilowatt hours in the 106 electric. It was 24 kilowatt hours in the Nissan Leaf. The range was, a mild improvement, 80 to 90 miles in the Nissan Leaf, but bear in mind that 106 was originally 50 miles. That's a good improvement. And obviously EVs have come a long, long way since then. Just to point out, the latest Nissan Leaf does 220 miles per charge. So 0 to 60, the Leaf allegedly is 10 seconds. It feels faster than that, actually, especially, that initial sort of getting up to 30, 40 miles an hour in particular is very, very fast. Again, that will just destroy any petrol car off the line. The charging socket by this point on the Leaf, on the 106 had been upgraded to Type 2, which is what most electric vehicles have today. The charging sockets in the 2014 Nissan Leaf Type 1, which was also fairly standard at the time, but is also compatible with public charge points, and CHAdeMO for rapid charging, which would top it up from 0 to 80% in about 30 minutes. You would get a meaningful amount of charge in a sort of 15-20 minute splash and dash. And then it would be 4 hours to charge using a Type 1 to Type 2 cable, using the kind of charge point that you saw in the previous photo in the background. So, pretty quick to charge up, because this is designed to be compatible with proper charging infrastructure that delivers more power, including a domestic wall box that you would have on your house. Whereas the 106 was still using a 3-pin plug to charge up, really, because although it had a Type 2 socket on the car, the other end of the cable was still a 3-pin plug, so 8 hours to charge. This is where the cost gets interesting, because that Leaf cost me £8,000 second-hand in 2017. In 2012, it cost me £8,000 to do the battery upgrade on the 106 alone. So I got an entire spaceship of a car in terms of all the onboard amazing features, which I'll explain in a second, for the same cost as what batteries were about 5 years beforehand. So batteries are improving and the costs are falling very rapidly. So what are the advantages of the Leaf versus an internal combustion engine car, a petrol or a diesel engine car? As I said before, there's instant torque. It's just rapid acceleration on these things. And they're amazing at hill climbing as well. In fact, on Plug Life Television, I did a Skye road trip. So Edinburgh to the Isle of Skye in a supposedly short-range Nissan Leaf. And we went to, Skye itself has some seriously big hills on it, as does the Isle of Raasay, which is right next to it. And if you watch that 2-part special, you'll see just how effortlessly this machine coped with hills that petrol and diesel cars were being, revved the living daylights out of them in first gear. The Leaf was just taking them no bother. Regenerative braking, so actually instead of using the foot brake as soon as you lift off the throttle, any electric car will use its electric motor in reverse, basically, to put that kinetic energy as electrical energy back into the battery. So you actually rarely need to use the foot brakes, and that's perfect for driving in rush hour. Instant heating as well. You don't need to wait on a petrol or diesel engine warming up. You have a resistive heater, and in many cases a heat pump, which allows for more efficient distribution of heat once the car is up, well, the resistive heater is up to temperature. And that means that you're able to just instantly get cabin heat without having to wait. There's massively improved reliability, very, very, very little in terms of moving components on an electric car versus hundreds of moving components in a petrol or diesel engine. So these things, in particularly the Nissan Leaf actually, is a virtually indestructible car. And then one of my favorite features actually is the smartphone app. The Nissan Leaf was the first to feature the preheat function. So actually, you could be waking up on a morning when it's all snowy and frosty and you know that you've got to get to work. Your neighbours are all scraping the windscreens and they've got the engine running, they've got the windscreen wipers going full blast. They're going to be like that for 10, 15 minutes. I just roll over, grab my smartphone, load up the app, press auto defrost, and the car's resistive heater comes on and defrosts the entire car and gets the cabin nice and cozy. If the car is not plugged in, it'll use the battery to do that, but it doesn't take that much energy to do it because it's a big, big battery designed to do, to power a big machine many, many miles, whereas a resistive heater is only about 3 kilowatts. And also, if it's still plugged into the mains, if the car is still plugged into the mains, it will bypass the battery and draw mains electricity, so you don't actually use any battery power to do the defrost. My personal record with this was when I was down in the West Midlands again for a conference. And my other half was up in Edinburgh. She needed to use the car. It was a really frosty morning. And she texted me and said, "Can you defrost the car for me, please?" And I pressed the preheat function from 330 miles away and defrosted the car for my other half. So expectations versus reality. Despite having been driving EVs at this point for 8 years, I decided that, well, I was obviously going to be replacing the 106 electric, which was only used for shorter trips like Dundee to St Andrews, which was my daily drive at the start of my PhD. And that was going to be used in tandem with a 2001 Mark I Honda Insight, which is, to this day, just about the most efficient car on the road that doesn't have a plug on it. That car there does 70 miles per gallon at 70 miles an hour without even trying. Personal best of 101 miles per gallon on 80 miles of hilly motorway. And it looks like something out the Jetsons and the colour is a bit Marmite, but that is a rare beast. And it's, it's something that I used for cross-country journeys at the time because the 106 obviously would have taken 8 hours to charge. The Leaf, however, has rapid charge capability. So I initially thought that I'd be using my Leaf much in a similar manner to the 106. So I would do my 50-mile round-trip commute to to my job at the time, and I would use it for general kind of short journeys. And then as for the Insight, I'd be doing cross-country trips from Edinburgh to Glasgow, Dundee, Ayrshire, or trips down south. In reality, the Leaf proved itself to be so versatile. This Leaf with the smallest battery of any specification of Leaf, and one of the smallest batteries of any electric car that you'll be able to buy first or second hand today, was so versatile that I ended up using it on all trips throughout Scotland because the rapid charging network was ample and you could just get a top up and be on your way again. And it was so cheap to run as well. Even factoring in the cost of rapid charging, you were pennies because you were charging it at home most of the time. And it was increasingly used on trips down south. In fact, that Leaf has gone from Edinburgh as far south as Leeds and as far north as Skye. So way beyond its battery range, but the charging infrastructure, as I said, combined with short stops for a few minutes to top up, get a boost to go on to the next rapid charger. Honestly, it was incredibly pleasant to do those long journeys. The Insight got marginalised. It was used on the occasional trip down south and the occasional short run to stop it seizing up. I've actually retired the Insight due to lack of use. That is now in the same transport museum as my 106 electric because the Insight was being used so little it kept seizing up and having issues that were caused by lack of use. So let's move on to some myths. What about people who say they can't afford an EV? EVs are surprisingly affordable. And I can say this because I bought one when I was a student. And I bought one whilst I was coming out of being a student and trying to kind of save up money for other adult things, and I still managed to get my hands on one. So there are numerous affordable EV purchasing options. PCP is what over 80% of cars, not just electric cars, but cars in the UK are bought through PCP. So you're basically leasing the car having paid a little down payment, and then you can either hand it back to the dealer or pay a final balloon payment to buy it outright. That's how the vast majority of people do it. You get EVs that way as well. Hire purchase, pay monthly, own the car at the end. Most EV manufacturers do that. Salary sacrifice scheme, exclusively for purely electric vehicles. You can get an electric company car. The monthly payments for that are pre-tax. So you can actually get yourself either an absolute bargain of an electric car if you go for something like the Leaf that's that's quite mainstream, that's generally considered more affordable, or if you would normally go for like a BMW 3 Series, you could get yourself a Tesla for about the same price. Because you're getting such a saving on this. You can get yourself some flashy piece of kit for the same price that you would have paid anyway for a petrol or diesel car. Leasing, there are many EV leasing specialists out there. Drive Electric is particularly good. They have some legendary deals, and one of those, the cheapest they have at the moment, is the Smart 4.4, not to be confused with the 4.2. This is a 4-seater car, perfect for local commutes. And obviously it's capable of topping up reasonably quickly with it's like a 22 kilowatt charger on it, which is not anywhere near as fast as the latest stuff, but for general kind of poodling about the West Midlands, that kind of idea, it's perfect for a lot of people. £139 a month to lease that car. Like, a lot of people spend that in petrol. And then £193 a month for a Renault Zoe that does about 250 miles per charge and can rapid charge via AC or DC. So it's an omnivore. It'll max out whatever you plug into. I believe actually that was a special offer, that 193 a month. It might be just over 200 now, but I did have a look on the website yesterday, and the Hyundai Ioniq, which is a good family car, with a 180 to 200 mile range, I believe it's about £193 a month. So there's still good options there in the sub £200 bracket, and that's a tiny cross section of what they have available. So bearing in mind that for a typical 50 mile per gallon petrol or diesel car, 1,000 petrol or diesel miles a month costs £110. How many miles do you drive? And how much does your car itself cost per month? If you are doing PCP or leasing, how much is that costing you? And then you've got the cost of fuel on top of it. And then you've got the cost of tax on top of that. You are saving that straight away because EVs are tax free. And on top of that, if you're able, especially if you're able to charge at home, you're talking pennies. Is your EV going to depreciate like a stone? Actually, the residual values are holding really strong. So they're holding a lot stronger than petrol, diesel, or hybrid. So it's been an interesting market to follow. During my WMG days, I saw the value of the likes of the Leaf that I bought plummet because this was a new tech and people were wary of it. So yeah, they really did tank. But then they started climbing again. And in fact, my Leaf here, in May 2016, that would have cost me £6,500 to buy for a 2014 model with less miles on the clock. I was really annoyed in May 2017 because I had to flesh out an extra £1,500 to get my hands on it. And I thought, I wish I'd made the jump earlier. In May 2018, I was laughing my way to the bank because that exact same car, exact same age, and with even more mileage on it, was worth £10,000. And even today, with even greater variety of electric vehicles coming on the market and faster charging speeds and greater range and so on, that Leaf is still worth more than what I paid for it. And we're seeing similar trends for other early EVs like the Mitsubishi i-MiEV and the Renault Zoe, the original Renault Zoe. And that's a clear indication of increasing demand for electric vehicles, especially now that the 2030 internal combustion engine ban has been announced by the government as well. All of this was happening before that ban was announced, and it's becoming even more crazy now. Like, the market is really kicking off. And also, in terms of other really really attractive newer cars, the prices of a used Kia e-Niro SUV or a Tesla Model 3 are actually really close to that of brand new versions of those models. It's a proper buying frenzy at the moment. But is that pricing people with low budgets out of the market? Not if you run the numbers. There are still bargains to be had on the second-hand market. So let's take the Mitsubishi i-MiEV second-hand. It is typically the cheapest modern electric vehicle. It can rapid charge. It can do 60 to 80 miles per charge, depending on the weather, that kind of thing. Typical price is about £6,000 on the second-hand market. As I said, it'll do motorway speeds as well. People who've got them say they're great wee runabouts. They're also really easy to park in urban environments because they're quite compact little machines. However, it's second-hand, so it may not necessarily be eligible for PCP or lease, although I'm aware of some dealerships that will do that for some cars. But let's say that, for the sake of argument, you have to buy it outright. However, other finance options exist. One of the best used electric car dealers is EcoCars. And I say this because Jonathan Porterfield, who's based up in Orkney and runs EcoCars, he's been heavily involved in electric vehicles for at least a decade now as well. He will source electric vehicles to order and he will sell them all over the UK. He'll deliver them all over the UK. And he comes very highly regarded by the likes of Fully Charged with Robert Llewellyn. He's personally supplied 6 electric cars to myself, my friends, and my family, including people in Kenilworth. So, yeah, he's really good at what he does. Some dealers don't know what they're talking about as much with EVs, but Jonathan is really, really good. So worth pointing that out. Anyway, one thing that he offers, which you don't necessarily need to go for, but it's an option that he gives, is he's partnered up with Car Loan Warehouse to give loans. So, personal loans to allow you to spread the cost of your electric vehicle. So let's take this example with a 5-year loan at 7.9% APR. That monthly repayment is £121 a month. Is that good value for money? Let's compare it against its toughest competition, the cheapest car on AutoTrader at the time of writing. And that is this Ford Fiesta here, 1.3 litre Ford Fiesta for 195 quid. So, pretty hard to beat it on purchase prices. But I tell you what, I'm going to make that car. I'm going to give that car away. I'm going to give you that petrol car for free. And let's see how quickly the running costs stack up. So, that Fiesta is doing 40 miles per gallon. The Mitsubishi i-MiEV is doing 4 miles per kilowatt hour, or per unit of electricity that you pay for at home. That fuel cost, we'll assume, is 15 pence per kilowatt hour of electricity. You can get cheaper electricity tariffs, especially because you can get overnight electricity tariffs that pay really cheap rates. A good example is Octopus Energy. It's their Octopus Go tariff, gives you 4 hours at 5 pence per kilowatt hour overnight. So it's very popular with electric vehicle drivers. Petrol and diesel are typically about £1.20 a litre on average. Tax, nothing for the electric car, £150 for the Fiesta. Annual maintenance costs, I've assumed about 120 for the i-MiEV. There's not much that's going to go wrong with it. It's very mechanically simple. Kick the tyres and say it's fine, passed its MOT. I know from painful experience of my earlier days of car ownership, you're looking at £500 a year to keep a Fiesta like that on the road. Loan repayments are £121 a month for the i-MiEV, nothing for your free petrol car. Now, if we're doing what I was doing, 12,000 miles a year, the monthly running costs, including electricity, for the i-MiEV are £168.87. The running costs for the petrol car are £190, of which £136.50 is in fuel alone. And in fact, if you're able to charge for free, there are still some charge points that are generously offered free of charge, no pun intended, for customers or employees, workplace charge points, that kind of idea. If you can get free electricity, it's actually cheaper per month to run the i-MiEV than it is to fuel, just fuel, which is buy the petrol for that petrol car, which is absolutely bonkers. But there's more. There is more to this story, because that loan that I mentioned earlier is, that's just one. If you actually compare the market, if you go to Money Saving Expert, you'll see that you can get much cheaper rates, like 3.3% for that amount of money, for example. And if you rerun those figures, then the running costs for the i-MiEV, including electricity, go down to £156 a month, of which, if you can charge for free, it's £118 a month to run that car. It's so cheap. So it's even cheaper than a free petrol car, and it just gets better from there. But what if you need a bigger car or a car that has more range? Again, let's look at Money Saving Expert. I found this deal here where it was where are we now? Yeah, 2.9% APR, and I've said let's spread the payments out over 7 years on that one, and we'll go for a £20,000 loan maximum. So if we look at a 30 kilowatt hour Nissan Leaf, they're currently coming in round about the £10,000 mark. If you look in the right place, they'll do 110 miles per charge. They actually charge a bit faster than my 24 kilowatt hour Leaf as well. And then there's the original Hyundai Ioniq. which I've said £20,000. I've seen quite a few between £17,000 to £20,000. These are amazingly efficient cars, the Hyundai Ioniq, not to be confused with the hybrid or the plug-in hybrid, the fully electric Ioniq. It came in 3 different variants. It is one of the most efficient cars on the market. Easily does 5 miles per kilowatt hour. My in-laws bought one from Luton and drove it all the way up to Glasgow, and they absolutely loved it. And it rapid charges really quickly too. It's a really well-designed machine, so highly recommend it. And if you run through with those loan costs and things, you're looking at £179 a month for the 30 kilowatt hour Nissan Leaf, and for the Mark 1 Hyundai Ioniq, you're looking at about £303 per month. But that's a worst case scenario for the Ioniq. You could potentially get it a bit cheaper as well. As I say, people who've got these 2 cars tend to rave about them, especially the Ioniq. So it pays to shop around. But what if your petrol or diesel car has much better fuel economy than that? EVs do still work out cheaper. So I'm going to pit my Leaf against its toughest competition, and that was the car that sat next to it on the driveway until very recently, the Mark 1 Honda Insight. It's pretty much impossible to beat the Insight on petrol efficiency. It also qualifies for free tax. Its maintenance costs are considerably less. It does require the gold service from Honda to stop it seizing up, but it's all about TLC with these things. Such an efficient car to run, and yet I was still saving £800 a year versus one of the most efficient petrol cars on the road. There's no competition. The EV is always going to work out cheaper. And that's why that Honda Insight is now in a transport museum. But most people don't have a 70 mile per gallon car, or a car that can realistically do that. So let's compare like for like as well, because the Insight was a 2-seater diminutive little space capsule from something out the Jetsons. It wasn't a full 5-seater family car with a good boot on it. And that's what the Nissan, this is the facelifted Nissan Leaf that I'm comparing against here. So very similar specs in terms of its efficiency and so on, but it will do more range. And then a similar car to compare it to is a Skoda Octavia diesel, because it's a 5-seater family car with decent boot space. And that's doing about 50 miles per gallon, which is quite representative. And again, if you run these figures, you see that you're actually saving over £1,300 a year versus a typical petrol or diesel car or hybrid for typical family use. And on top of that, if you had that Octopus Go tariff that I mentioned earlier, where you were getting 5 pence per kilowatt hour overnight, that saving is nearer £1,600 a year. Now, a very common myth that is peddled about is that you need to replace the battery after 5 years. That is not the case. EV batteries last a lot longer than you might think. Here is a prime example of that. This is a famous taxi, electric taxi called Wizzy, the Nissan Leaf from C&C Taxis in Cornwall. And here it is celebrating reaching 100,000 miles on the clock. Remember, this is a car that realistically had an 80 to 90 mile range, and it was being rapid charged constantly as well because it was a taxi. So it's like, you'll get it back out on the road, get it back out on the road. It's just rolled over to 100,000 miles. And you'll notice, so see where it says 85 miles and you got all those big fat bars on the right. You'll see the little skinny bars immediately to the right of those. There's 2 red ones at the bottom, and then there's 10 that go all the way up along the edge. Those are the state of health bars. They show you how much battery capacity is left when that car is fully charged. What is its maximum capacity today versus what it was when it was new? In other words, how much range has it lost? And it's still got all 12 of its state of health bars after 100,000 miles. So the battery's in excellent health. Bear in mind that your typical petrol car is starting to develop engine issues at 100,000 miles. You're going to have to pay to get the timing belt replaced, and you're maybe having to look at head gasket issues or whatever. It's going to start giving you grief. But this Leaf, the battery was still fine, the motor was still fine, it was still running really smoothly. It was retired as a taxi after clocking up 174,000 miles in 4 years, which is an insane amount for a car that did about 80 to 90 miles per charge. And the total mechanical repairs in all of that time, just as a side note, well, there it is there. 1 ball bearing. Name 1 petrol or diesel car that can name that level of reliability. So why are electric vehicles so reliable? How can they defy the laws of car ownership? There's a few reasons for this, as to why they are the most reliable vehicles on the road. There's far less moving components, so there's less to break in the first place. An electric motor just has one moving component. An internal combustion engine, petrol or diesel, has hundreds of moving components. An electric vehicle doesn't need a clutch, it doesn't need a gearbox, doesn't need an exhaust gas regulator, a timing belt. I'm just reeling off the stuff that's broken on my petrol and diesel cars before. Head gaskets, all that sort of stuff. It's expensive when it goes wrong. A petrol or a diesel car, but an electric car just has so little to break on it. So it just doesn't really. There's far less heat and vibration as well. Electric motors are really smooth, they're really efficient. Batteries, when cooled properly, don't get overly hot, certainly in comparison to the temperatures that you get in an internal combustion engine going up into the hundreds of degrees. You just don't get that in an electric car. So very little energy is wasted as heat. And also, you've got less rattling, you've got much greater efficiency as well. So lots of wasted energy as heat for the heat and vibration in a petrol or diesel car, and that physically shakes itself to bits after a while. And then the batteries themselves, why do they last longer than phone or laptop batteries? Because they're lithium-ion too, aren't they? So why do phone or laptop batteries last like 3 years and then die? Well, first reason is that there's a lot better battery management in electric vehicles. You've got better control electronics that are looking after every single cell that makes up the battery pack and making sure that they're within their optimum voltage range, they don't get too high a current, so they don't get too hot, they aren't forced to work too hard if they're too cold. You've got active thermal management, so air or liquid cooling and heating systems in the vast majority of electric cars that stop the batteries from overheating as well. Whereas you've also got a different operating environment. So electric vehicles typically in the UK will operate between -10 and +30 degrees C. So that suits batteries really well. Their optimum temperature range for lithium ion, well, the optimum temperature spot is about 25 degrees C, because that's a good balance between performance and lifespan. So that kind of range there is fine for an electric vehicle battery. Phones, however, typically live in your pocket. They're very close. The battery is very close to the processor. If you've got lots of apps running, you're easily talking 37 to 50 degrees C. It's always warm. It causes the cell to degrade quicker. Laptops, similar situation. The battery is very close to the processor, which will get up to 90 degrees C if you're really hammering it. And that means that the battery is exposed to very hot temperatures and to a temperature gradient as well, because some of the cells in that battery pack are closer to the processor than others. Here's an example of an old battery pack out of a laptop. The cover has been removed and sat up the top there, and you can see the 2 rows of cells on the bottom. And as the arrow indicates, it slides into the laptop as if it was going into the bottom of the screen. That row that's highlighted there is therefore closer to the processor, and therefore it gets hotter, and those cells degrade quicker. And in fact, if you were to open up a battery pack like that, don't try this at home, and you were to test all of those cells individually, the row that is circled there, you'd find that the cells were dead. But the row above it, the one that's closest to the outside, those cells are probably still in quite good condition. So you could actually make 2 healthy laptop battery packs out of 2 supposedly dead ones. So you can make 1 healthy laptop battery pack out of 2 supposedly dead ones. And that's just because there's poor thermal management in comparison to an electric vehicle. So hopefully by this point, you're quite convinced about this whole EV malarkey. Here's a few tips for purchasing an electric vehicle. First of all, check the battery state of health. I mentioned those little state of health bars, the skinny bars there. This one here, the fat bars, there aren't all of them. That just means that the battery isn't fully charged. But the skinny ones you can see are all there. That means that battery is in good condition. Make sure that you get both cables supplied with your electric vehicle. So you'll have a Type 2 cable. The one on the left there, you'll see obviously there's 2 different looking connectors. The one on the right of that, the one that's kind of in the middle of the coil, is Type 2. That's what you'd plug into a public charge point. And the vast majority of electric cars have that same thing on the car itself as well. The other one that you see there is Type 1, which is used on the older Nissan Leaf. So that's used for public charging. It's also used for home charging if you have a socketed charge point as opposed to a tethered plug on a lead. I like socketed charge points because it means that if you have a relative who has an older Nissan Leaf that has that Type 1 connection, they can use their own cable to plug into your home charge point. And if you have any modern electric car that has Type 2, you can use that as well. There's not going to be a compatibility issue. And make sure that you get your 3-pin cable as well. So that means that you can plug it into a domestic socket, and there's not going to be any issues if you're out in the sticks or if you're visiting friends and relatives who don't have a charge point. That was really useful when we went to Isle of Skye, our holiday cottage didn't have a charge point, but I just ran that cable out the window and I got a full charge overnight. Also worth pointing out that depending on the type of car that you have, the charging speed typically on a Type 2 cable is 7 kilowatts, but if your car has a 3-phase onboard charger, it could go up to 22 kilowatts, which is not to be sniffed at, because that's a surprisingly quick charging rate, especially if you're nipping away to go to a restaurant or shopping or something like that. You'll come back to a lot more range in the battery if you have that 3-phase onboard charger. The 3-pin one, as I said, useful in emergencies or charging at friends and relatives. And it supports a much lower charging rate, but it's still useful, especially if it's overnight or if you're going to be there for a while anyway. So when buying an electric vehicle, check out the Energy Saving Trust website. You'll see the number of loans and grants and incentives that you're entitled to. For example, OLEV, Office of Low Emission Vehicles, has a grant towards installing a home charge point. So you don't pay the full cost, or you get a nice little discount on that. Shop around as well for the best home charger quote. I particularly like the Zappi smart charger, the My Energy Zappi smart charger, which is designed and built in Britain and has a whole host of tricks up its sleeve, because if you have solar panels, then that charger will monitor how much electricity your solar panels are producing. It'll monitor how much electricity your house is consuming, and it'll pump the difference into your car without importing from the grid. So you could potentially be completely self-sufficient. So yeah, the Zappi is a very popular charger. There's loads of friendly help and advice from your local EV owners groups, not least the Kenilworth EV owners group, of course, but there's also the EV Groups Nexus. There's a Warwickshire EVs owners group as well that's on that Nexus. Typically on these groups, if you have a question, either to do with buying an electric car, which one to go for, what charge point to go for, or owning an electric car, if you run into trouble or something like that, how do I use this particular charge point, which app do I need, or whatever. If it's one that's not on your typical journey and it's quite an unusual one, or an obscure network or something, you'll typically get like 6 answers within the space of 5 minutes, and they'll all be very helpful. The people will come to your rescue straight away. EV reviews and news as well from Fully Charged, from Robert Llewellyn, who was the chap who presented Scrap Heap Challenge and played Crichton in Red Dwarf. He's been running Fully Charged to do with electric vehicles for a decade now. He's very enthusiastic about EVs. He's properly committed to the cause, and you'll get some really useful information there. And also remember these EV specialists. I mentioned EcoCars. If you're looking for a pre-owned electric vehicle, I simply would not go anywhere else. I would speak to Jonathan immediately. Tell him I sent you. He'll do you a good deal. And then Drive Electric as well. If you want to go down the leasing option, they've been in the electric vehicle space for years. They really understand it, and some of their deals are legendary, like the ones I mentioned earlier. So definitely worth checking them out too. And of course, I'm always happy to help. You'll find me on Twitter at 106Euan. And I always do my best to make myself available to assist anyone with their EV queries wherever I can. And on top of that, there is my YouTube channel, Plug Life Television, where I cover various different aspects. I cover the battery electrochemistry and the implications for your electric vehicle. I cover EV success stories from around the world, not least the epic road trip through Norway, which has the highest uptake of electric vehicles of anywhere in the world. It is incredible what they've managed to achieve, and it's basically a snapshot into our future. I've also got the Plug Life Manifesto, where I kind of demonstrate what would be sensible policies to put in place to improve the decarbonisation of various different transport sectors. And as well, there is the Watt Barrier series, which shows how we'll be able to balance the grid, how we'll be able to balance raw materials from batteries, and social mobility as well. You want to make sure that these electric vehicles are accessible to everyone, that they're not just a middle-class pastime. And I show how that can all be achieved on Plug Life Television. So thank you very much for your time. I will gladly take any questions that you have.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Euan. I do have some questions. So Rob Barry has asked a question. Given the low maintenance of EVs that you've mentioned, Euan, do you have to pay for breakdown recovery?
That's a good question. I have breakdown recovery as part of my part of like a bank account I have anyway, so I've not bothered to take out a separate one. I generally wouldn't really bother with breakdown cover. But that said, it's a handy kind of peace of mind in case you get a puncture on the motorway or something like that. It makes sense to have breakdown cover, but it's more a case of in case something happens that's beyond your control, like a deer runs out and hits you, or you get a puncture, that kind of idea. The thing's not really going to break on you. I mean, I remember the last fully fossil-fueled car I had broke down on the motorway on the way to selling it. It was literally on its way to its buyer. And the chap from the AA came along, and he was, knee deep in grease and all this stuff under the bonnet, ripping bits out, trying to coax this thing back to life. And we were talking about electric vehicles. He was like, "Oh, they're never going to work." No. It's like, do you not realize the irony of what you're saying here? I've never had an EV die on me. They just run and run and run. So yeah, breakdown cover is good for peace of mind, but it's not because it's going to mechanically break on you. It's because you might hit a nail on the motorway or something like that. So
okay, two things that come from that then. One, bearing in mind the talk recently of the skill sets of people, do garages understand EVs? Can you go to your local garage to get your second-hand EV serviced, or do you need a specialist garage?
Well, there's a garage near me that does MOTs, and whilst I normally use the Electron garage that I mentioned earlier in Fife because they are an EV specialist garage, and they understand EVs the most. Plus, they're just a really good team, and they can do really nifty stuff like battery upgrades and things like that. So they can get into the high voltage and they can boost the range of an old Nissan Leaf from. They'll take a 24 kilowatt hour battery out of it and put in like a 41 or something like that. And all of a sudden you have this machine that's still mechanically robust and will run for hundreds of thousands of miles. And you've just repowered this old machine for the fraction of the price of a new one. So they can do all that amazing stuff. But just your typical garage, like my local one, for MOTs, for servicing, for brakes, suspension, the typical car bits, anyone can touch it. Anyone will handle it. There won't be any concerns there. So I've had my cars MOT'd and serviced both at specialist garages and at general garages. More and more garages, however, are starting to appreciate the not just the robustness of EVs, but the business potential in providing specialist services tailored to the kind of repowering of electric vehicles to make them last even longer. So, I mean, for example, not a million miles away from Kenilworth is Cleveley EV, which is in Cheltenham. I know it's still a bit of a stretch, but still. Cleveley EV, for the likes of my Nissan Leaf, they could not only swap out the battery and put like a new higher capacity one in, but they can put a range extending battery in the boot, which actually takes up surprisingly little space. At first glance, you wouldn't realize it was there. And that will allow an old battery that's already in the vehicle to work in tandem with this range extending battery to give a huge boost in range. We're looking at 24 kilowatt hour Nissan Leafs that were maybe down to like a 50-mile range or something because they've been absolutely hammered as a taxi, like several 100,000 miles. And they're now up to like 170, 180-mile range and things like this. It's incredible what they've done. So yeah, there's a network of garages, HEVRA, the Hybrid and Electric Vehicle Repair Alliance. And there's lots of garages across the country that are accredited by them, and they kind of share all of their knowledge for some of the more techie, high voltage stuff. But as I said, for getting new brake pads, which to be honest is rarely going to happen because of regenerative braking, so you rarely use the brakes. But if the handbrake cable starts to go or something like that, any garage will touch it, so you don't need to worry.
Good, thank you. Charging vehicles. So in Kenilworth, for example, we just have, I think, one fast charge, which is at the Holiday Inn. You might remember this has been the Montfort Hotel. It changed, rebranded. Could you briefly explain the various types of fast, in inverted commas, chargers? Some, in fact, John can cut in here because the District Council are going to be providing some fast charging units.
Excellent.
But what type of fast chargers are there, both that we can have in Kenilworth, and then when you're out on the motorways, in terms of the ones that you can use on the motorways?
Yeah, so for a town like Kenilworth, the sort of rapid charger that you have at the Holiday Inn is quite typical of the spec that you would expect, really. So that's a 50 kilowatt rapid charger, and that's a so-called triple-headed rapid charger. It has all of the formats that are used by electric cars. So you have CHAdeMO, which is what the Nissan Leaf uses, and that's a DC, it's a direct current thing. So the rapid charger itself is doing the conversion from AC coming in to DC going into the car. And so it's kind of like with a laptop, how you have in fact, there we go, the bulky, oh no, I'm not going to be able to reach, but kind of like how a laptop has that kind of chunky box thing on the cable, that's the charger. Whereas a desktop computer, you feed AC directly into it and it has an onboard charger. And that's what the car uses for slower charging. The exception to that is the older Renault Zoe, which had AC only. So it had a big onboard charger, bigger than any other car, and it could pull up to 43 kilowatts from AC. So there was a Type 2 AC connector, the kind of D-shaped one that you saw earlier, that's on this triple-headed rapid charger, basically just for Renault Zoes. If you have a vehicle that doesn't have a really big onboard charger, don't use that because you're wasting your own time and you're blocking a Renault Zoe from getting a charge. And then the most common rapid charging format these days is CCS, which is basically that Type 2 thing, the D-shaped one, with two big fat pins underneath it. So it's kind of like a D, but then with a kind of ovally bit underneath. And the vast majority of electric cars today have that fitted. The most common rookie error is that someone will pull up at a rapid charger with a CCS vehicle and grab the Type 2 because it fits into it. Whereas they actually need the CCS to get a rapid charge because it's a DC rapid charging format. So it needs the charger to do the conversion and the high power stuff rather than the car itself. So it's easy when you know how. And that's the kind of triple-headed rapid chargers you'll get. Some networks like Instavolt, they have DC only rapid chargers, so they don't have Type 2 on them because they know that the Renault Zoe with its onboard charger, that's a legacy format. Renault themselves have switched to CCS with the latest model, so they've just not bothered adding it. When you're out and about in motorway service stations or at dedicated charging hubs, again, you'll see some 50 kilowatt rapid chargers, but you'll also see an increasing number of high power chargers that have those same formats that we discussed there, but typically just the DC ones, CHAdeMO and CCS. If your car is capable of taking higher power, then those chargers will deliver that. And in fact, if you look at GridServe, they've just launched, or officially going to launch next week, a fully electric, basically fully electric service station with something like 36 chargers, some of which can provide 50 kilowatts, some of which can provide 350 kilowatts. There's only like one car on the market that comes close to drawing that amount of power at the moment, but we'll see more and more of them coming on the market soon. So, there's some pretty impressive charging infrastructure. And of course, if you have a Tesla, there are Tesla superchargers as well, which are for Teslas only. It's the only vehicles that are compatible with them, but they tend to be installed in quite large numbers at motorway service stations or hotels. And they are very nippy things to use. Typically for using rapid chargers, a lot of them have contactless payment, although it may be cheaper to use an RFID card or an app associated with that charging network. But if it's a network that you've never used before, then if it's got a contactless card reader on it, that means you can just tap and charge straight away. With Tesla superchargers, you just plug the car in, and because it's Tesla hardware and Tesla car, there's no additional input required. They sort it out amongst themselves, including payment details, and away you go.
There's a question regarding, apparently there's a number of 7 kilowatt chargers around now.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So that's more for destination charging. So what you would typically have there is it would be a socket, a Type 2 socket, and you would bring your own Type 2 cable, like I mentioned earlier. So those are designed for longer stays. So you rock up, you plug in, you start charging, walk away, come back in a few hours when you're finished shopping, when you're finished working, when you're finished eating, whatever. And they're obviously they're really useful for workplaces. They're useful for shopping centres, useful for town centres as well. Rapid chargers are like petrol pumps for electric cars. So what you do there is you ideally stay with or near the car. If you're at like a motorway service station, obviously nip in, use the bathroom, whatever, grab a sandwich. But don't take liberties. Don't abandon your car there for longer than you need to. You take what you need and then you move on, because rapid chargers are designed for people who are in a hurry. So you want to vacate them and let someone else on as soon as possible. They also tend to be more expensive in destination chargers because of the additional cost of the hardware, which is about 10 times as much as it is for the 7 kilowatt post that was mentioned. And also the cost of the electrical installation. That means that the tariff tends to be higher to offset the actual capital costs. It's not people ripping you off, it's just the cost of this stuff. But to pay for the convenience, you can't get 50 kilowatts of electricity at home unless you're very, very lucky. And also it's kind of like paying for a Starbucks coffee versus one you've made with made at home. You're getting a premium service, and when you consider the amount of times that you need to rapid charge, the additional cost is a drop in the ocean versus the overall super cheap running costs of EVs. And even if you did exclusively rapid charging EV, it would still work out cheaper than petrol or diesel anyway.
Good, thank you. I just
George and Euan, I can come and just give an update about Kenilworth here, if you like.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so the latest information we have about Kenilworth is that we're due to have 5 dual units installed early in the new year. So could be as early as January, but certainly by the end of March. And we think the plan is for 4 dual units. That means there'll be 8 plug-in points installed in the Abbey End car park, and there'll be one located somewhere on street, so away from the car parks. We don't have information about where that location will be, but there'll be 7 kilowatt chargers. So it'll be the same as Euan's destination chargers. You need to plug in for probably 2 or 3 hours to get a decent charge. So it will be for people who are shopping, maybe for workers and local residents and so on.
Yeah,
that's the update we have at the moment.
What I would feed back to the council is that it's actually not that much more expensive to put in a 3-phase version of a destination charge point. There's only a couple of £100 in it. So if there is a 3-phase power supply, at that car park or at that pavement, you are just as well putting in one that will do 22 kilowatts as one that will do 7 kilowatts. Now, not all vehicles can pull 22 kilowatts with their onboard charger. The likes of my Nissan Leaf tops out at 7 kilowatts. But my Tesla that I bought quite recently has 22 kilowatts worth of onboard charger. So that means that rather than adding 20 to 30 miles of range per hour, I could be adding 70 to 100 miles of range per hour. And that's really useful. In fact, I recently did Edinburgh to Oban and back, which is a very, very long way in that Tesla. And I didn't touch a rapid charger once because I was just using 22 kilowatt destination charge points, because in Scotland, the vast majority of these dual-headed posts that have been installed are 22 kilowatts. Because the price difference is so minimal, the local authorities have gone, you know what, it makes sense to future-proof it. And heck, once we put a charging tariff in place, if we can get people to consume even more electricity, then we make even more of a profit. So it's a win-win, because the council can sell more and make more money, in theory, if the car is capable of it. And it means that people will get a faster charge with many different makes and model of car. Whereas 7 kilowatts is fine for installing as a domestic wall box or something, but really for public charging infrastructure, it future-proofs it to make it a 22 kilowatt one. So I would feed that back to the council. The additional cost will be quickly offset by return on revenue and extra convenience. Oh, George, you're on mute.
Can you feed that back to the council, John?
Yes, I certainly can, although I was on another call at the time, but certainly we can chat about that. And I think we may actually have a couple of people from district council listening in as we speak, but we can certainly talk about that at a later time.
Oh, good. I have a question from Fern. So Fern has asked Euan, are public chargers universal across brands? And then the second part is, if a car is left for a long time, so say, for example, in the new normal, whenever that might be, you drive to an airport, leave your car and fly off someplace and then come back, will the power drain from your battery?
Right. So the universal compatibility of charge points, absolutely, like the socketed destination posts that we were talking about there, every car has a cable that can plug into them. So that's 100% universal. There's no issue. With rapid chargers, every car can use them. Because 99.9% of cars, electric cars on the road, will have either CHAdeMO or CCS. The bulk of them have CCS. The vast majority of rapid chargers have CCS. CHAdeMO is actually sometimes not found on the really, really high power chargers. So, for example, the Ionity network, which does really high power charging infrastructure at motorway service stations, is CCS only. So a Nissan Leaf couldn't use it, but then again, it couldn't really draw very high power. So it would be as well going to like a nearby Ecotricity one or something that does have CHAdeMO. But if you are unsure about the availability of the particular kind of plug that you require, as I say, like it's vanishingly rare that you would come across a situation where your car physically cannot use that charge point. But what you can do is you can download PlugShare, which is my favorite charging app, because that allows you to filter by the plug type of the vehicle. Likewise, ZapMap allows you to do the same as well. ZapMap's another really good app, and that allows you to filter by plug type. And therefore, if there's any charge points that aren't compatible with your vehicle, they will be excluded from the search, and you'll get a map that shows you where everything is. And the beauty of ZapMap and PlugShare is that users can update, they can leave little notes to say, I charged here successfully. Oh, side A is out of order. They can give photographic and like descriptive updates to let you know and give you peace of mind that this charger is going to work when you get to it. And another really good app as well, on a similar note, is WhatsApp, not to be confused with WhatsApp. So it's Watts as in electrical, WATTS, up. And that's a really clever app because, again, you put in what your vehicle is and it knows straight away, okay, yeah, so you're looking for CCS and you'll only be able to charge at 7 kilowatt on type 2. Cool, I've got this. And you tell it where you're going and it plans the journey for you, including charge stops. And it has, in the vast majority of networks, has the live availability of those rapid chargers as well. There's like 4 at this site, 2 are available. Yeah, go for it. That kind of idea. It's so that's not an issue. In terms of leaving the car for a long period of time, there's actually very little chance of it draining because unlike nickel metal hydride batteries or anything like that, which had high rates of self-discharge, lithium-ion batteries have very, very low self-discharge, maximum like 2% a month. If anything, you'll have more vampiric drain from the vehicle's electronics. So older Teslas were quite bad for that. And new Teslas that have Sentry mode, where they leave all the cameras on and they record everything in case anyone tries any funny business. So that will obviously drain the battery reasonably quickly. But then again, most of the cars that have that high level of vampiric drain will have an app you can use with your phone so you can check up on it and be like, oh yeah, I need to turn things off or I need to plug it in, that kind of idea. If anything, if you are leaving the car for a very long period of time, I'm not worried about having too little charge in the battery. I'm worried about having too much charge because it's bad practice to leave your car fully charged for several weeks or months on end, because that very gradually causes the battery to degrade. I would aim to leave it between 50 and 80% state of charge. And that means if you're leaving it for a long, long time, and that means that you'll have optimum battery health. And there's little chance of it draining itself completely by the time you get back.
Okay, a question linked to that from Bob Sherman. So Bob essentially runs low carbon Warwickshire. You might have met him in the past, Euan. So Bob has just said that cold temperatures he's found do reduce the range. Why is that?
So I actually have an entire episode of Plug Live Television on this. It's episode 8, which explains why does colder temperature affect the batteries. But to summarize, colder temperature, as the battery gets colder, it means that the kinetics get lower. So basically the ability of the lithium ions to go between the electrodes is reduced. It becomes harder for them to do it, which increases the internal resistance of the cell. And that means that if you are charging it at a given current, then going from resting voltage, just having, doing nothing with the battery, to applying the current, there'll be a jump in voltage regardless of how hot or cold the battery is. That's called the overpotential. And the same applies on discharge, but it's a drop down instead of a jump up. And the colder the battery, the higher the internal resistance, and the higher that overpotential is. And you don't want to go above the maximum voltage of the battery, which means that not only has the battery management system in the car decided to throttle back the maximum charge power to stop other degradation mechanisms that can happen, which I explain in the video, if you try to force a cold battery to do too much too quickly, but also it means it's going to hit its maximum voltage quicker, which means you have to turn down the current even more to stop it exceeding its maximum voltage, because that would cause more damage. So the car is cleverly managing itself in terms of charging speeds and things like that. And yeah, in terms of range, again, the same applies on discharge, with the internal resistance and that kind of drop down in voltage. You don't want to go below the minimum voltage because you can't discharge them all the way down to 0 volts lithium-ion batteries. It's typically about 2 to 3 volts, depending on the chemistry. The exact chemistry, there's actually quite a broad range of chemistries in lithium-ion. But anyway, you don't want to go below that because that can cause damage. So again, if you're starting to approach that, the battery management system is going to go, oh, hang on a minute. Okay, we don't have as much range as we'd, as we would have had if we were warmer. I'm going to throttle back a bit to preserve the life of the battery pack. But it's also worth pointing out that petrol and diesel cars have a significant reduction in range too. It's just that it's not as blatantly obvious. In colder temperatures, it's not as blatantly obvious because it doesn't really highlight it on the screen on the dashboard like an electric car does, that tells you to the nearest mile how much range you have left. Petrol and diesel cars tend to kind of hide that away a little bit. So yeah, I mean, not only that, but anyone who's walked down Kenilworth High Street in the middle of winter will know that diesel engines in particular, it takes them longer to warm up, and it takes longer for the supposedly emissions scrubbing systems in them to warm up. So it is even more toxic pollutants and nanoparticulates being chucked out of a diesel exhaust when it's cold, which is why winter weather air quality sucks on high streets that have lots of diesel cars on them.
Thank you. A question from Martin Drew, and there's been a little bit about this in the newspapers recently, Euan. So ethical and climate change problems caused by mining lithium, and also the cost and carbon as part of the construction of the vehicles and their batteries consuming resources. So how much of that is an issue? And then linked to that, Martin asks, might hydrogen be a cleaner alternative power source for the future rather than electric cars?
Right. So actually, there was a fairly local company to where you are that was is currently in very hot water. So Aston Martin has been caught red-handed setting up a sock puppet PR firm to push a piece that said that electric cars take 50,000 miles to offset the carbon associated with making them. That was thoroughly debunked by leading energy experts. The figure is nearer 10 to 15,000 miles, not 50. And it's possible to do it even greener than that. So there's some very interesting events happening in the West Midlands at the moment. Very high tension politics. So that's probably part of the reason why it's been in the news. Lithium, for a start, is a lot more abundant than people think. There's 14 million tons of it on land and 230 billion tons of it in the sea. And there's actually surprisingly little in a lithium-ion battery. It only makes up 7% of the cathode, the positive electrode, by weight. And that is a small percentage of the overall weight of the battery pack. Lithium, there's actually very lithium-rich brines down Cornish tin mines of old. So there's a company called British Lithium that's working on extracting those. So we could have we do have a native supply for our burgeoning battery industry. And lithium was actually, its value is so little that with older, less efficient battery recycling techniques, lithium wasn't recovered because they were more interested in cobalt and copper. But now the most efficient recycling techniques do recover lithium. And again, there are some really interesting developments, not least at the University of Birmingham, on lithium recycling. So it's possible to get that closed loop economy with lithium. Switching briefly to cobalt, cobalt is being phased out rapidly. So there's been a 90% reduction in cobalt content of leading lithium-ion batteries over the past decade, particularly for electric vehicles. That figure continues to decline. And in fact, Tesla are going to be using cobalt-free and nickel-free lithium iron phosphate, which is a very mature, very well-established chemistry like I had in my 106. But The difference is that they found a better way to package it to get even more range out of it, which had previously been the issue. So yeah, cobalt's not an issue. Lithium, the biggest issue arguably is the freshwater use with the Bolivia. It's Salar de Uyuni, which is the largest on-land lithium reserve in Bolivia, and it's the fresh water that's used to help extract the lithium from those brines. We don't have that issue in Cornwall because we've got so much rain, but with Salar de Uyuni, actually in Watt Barrier's Balancing Raw Materials Part 1 on Plug Live Television, I propose a solution to that, which involves desalination plants at the Chilean coast, and then solar panels on the pipeline feeding up to Salar de Uyuni, and also feeding local communities with fresh water along the way as well. Have we lost connection? Have we lost connection?
I can still.
Are we back? Yep, cool. Sorry. Oh yeah, I
can hear you, but your picture's frozen, Euan, but I can hear you perfectly.
Bear with me. I'm going to switch over to 4G as well, just in case. So yeah, Salar de Uyuni is, as I said, there's the freshwater concern, but it's actually not as scary as some people may think. There are ways and means about it, and it's entirely possible for nations to extract lithium from seawater.
What's the? There's another question from Bob Sherman. What's the latest on battery technology? I mean, where's battery technology going in the next 10 years, Euan?
So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to Martin's second question, which was to do with hydrogen, because this is really important.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot about that. Thank you.
There has been a big push from certain voices since the announcement of the 2030 ban on internal combustion engines towards hydrogen. And hydrogen is, there's several major issues. One, the vast majority of hydrogen at the moment comes from fossil fuels. Two, the big push on production of hydrogen is not technically from renewable energy, but actually so-called blue hydrogen, where you're still making it from fossil fuels and then you're stuffing the carbon dioxide underground. So it's still fossil fuel stuff, which is why oil companies love it and why they're pushing it. Hydrogen from electrolysis, and then the other processes involved, whether it's liquefaction or compression, and then the transportation, and then pumping it into a fuel cell vehicle and running it in a fuel cell, which is quite a reasonably inefficient device to begin with. It's more efficient than an internal combustion engine, don't get me wrong. But the amount of processes it goes through and the losses of all of those processes versus taking that same renewable electricity, putting it through the grid into batteries and powering an electric car, you require more than double the amount of electricity to do a hydrogen economy from renewables than you do electric cars. So actually, if we're worried about electricity consumption, the last thing you want to be doing is going with probably the least efficient so-called green method, which is hydrogen. Okay, you can go even less efficient, and that's synthetic fuels, taking it even further. So there's even more processes involved. But yeah, genuinely, hydrogen is massively, massively lossy. It's only about 30% efficient, whereas an EV from renewable electricity to wheel is nearer 70 plus. So hydrogen, to be honest, this actually links neatly into the third question about where's battery tech going. We're already seeing larger vehicles being fully electrified. So the number of niche applications where hydrogen makes more sense is actually being phased out quite rapidly. So near where I am, Ember is an electric coach company that is running an intercity coach from Dundee to Edinburgh and back again on one charge. That's a fully electric coach using lithium iron phosphate batteries, which are not energy dense. They're the ones that I said, there was the issues about the amount of energy you could actually squeeze into them. But a coach is that big, it can accommodate enough to go from Dundee to Edinburgh and back and still have over 40% electricity left in the battery, sort of 40% charge. So we're also seeing similar situations with battery trains from the likes of Viva Rail. We're seeing similar situations with battery delivery trucks and like larger HGVs coming onto the market. Meanwhile, hydrogen, it keeps being touted for haulage and so on, but the process has been glacial on that one. And meanwhile, we're seeing more and more battery tech coming online that has even more promising properties. So we're going to see not only lithium iron phosphate, which is that mature established chemistry that we've now found a better way to package to get more range out of a battery pack. We'll start seeing more of that in electric vehicles. We'll also start to see cobalt-free versions of cobalt-containing lithium chemistries. A prime example being Tesla, who use lithium nickel cobalt aluminium oxide, NCA. Jeff Dan and his research group across in Canada, who work very closely with Tesla, recently discovered that the cobalt that we thought was in there for stability purposes has actually just been in there for the ride all along. You don't actually need it. You can replace it with a far more abundant metal. So Tesla is probably going to go cobalt-free in its entirety within the next couple of years. And we're also going to see NMX, which is a cobalt-free version of lithium nickel manganese cobalt oxide, so NMC. That, again, is going to remove that cobalt issue. And so those are more kind of conventional chemistries. We've then got lithium sulfur, which completely replaces that cathode material with the heavy metals and things with sulfur. That's being developed by Oxus Energy in Oxford, and they've built a big construction plant in Brazil where they're going to be providing these cells for their first commercial customer, which I believe was electric buses. So yeah, they're actually quite lightweight as well. So the aerospace industry is very interested in lithium sulfur for electric flight. Then there is solid state lithium, which is the holy grail that everyone's been talking about. We're seeing kind of crude versions of solid state lithium coming onto the market. The promise there is that you'll have greater range within the battery, like at least a doubling of range, potentially faster charging speeds, potentially potentially improved temperature windows, so it could operate in colder or hotter temperatures. There's loads of advantages to it. And interestingly, major hydrogen proponent Toyota is also investing in solid-state battery research. So that would probably be 2025 to 2030 by the time we would see commercial variants of that on the market. But that is a promising chemistry. And then also on the kind of budget end of the market for your urban runabouts and for shorter range electric vehicles, there's sodium ion, which uses even more abundant stuff. It's sodium, it's salt. It's easy to get your hands on. There's allegedly going to be a 30% cost reduction associated with that because it's using more abundant materials and more sustainable materials. And sodium ion has the added advantage that you can reversibly and safely discharge it right the way down to 0 volts. So you could put you could short it out with a paperclip for transport, and it's not going to be bad. It's not going to be bad for it at all, which is a huge benefit when it comes to transporting these things safely. So yeah, I mean that's got a lot of potential there as well. We're starting to see automotive scale prototypes being developed in Scotland, actually, up in Thurso of all places. So yeah, I mean that's hopefully going to come onto the market by the mid-2020s from the looks of things. There's some really interesting developments, and that's just for batteries for electromobility, for electric cars and buses and planes and things. There's other interesting stuff going on for grid scale energy storage where space is less of a premium. But I shan't go off scope with this discussion.
Just sticking with Scotland, a question. Is it true that public chargers in Scotland are free?
They were. They're gradually having tariffs introduced. But yeah, my cousin, for example, who lived in Dundee until recently, she had an identical Nissan Leaf to mine, and she lived in a flat without her own charge point. But because Dundee had such excellent charging infrastructure, they've got multiple massive charging hubs, including one that was about a 5-minute walk from her house. So she never had any issues getting charged. And even before those hubs were built, she didn't have any issues getting charged. And I think her total electricity cost, while she lived in Dundee for several years, was under a tenner. And that was just for the occasional trip to somewhere that had like a paid for rapid charger like Instavolt at a petrol station or something like that. So yeah, amazingly cheap. But yeah, prices are coming in now.
Yeah, and we've got 10 minutes to go before we finish the webinar. Steve has just come in with a comment that doesn't need, Steve's point on hydrogen, which I think is very valid, is that hydrogen needs a similar infrastructure to petrol. Charging a battery EV can take place at home, work, Kenilworth, car parks, etc. So it's obviously a lot easier. Another question. How long will EVs be tax-free? So clearly the Treasury is going to lose revenue if people are not buying petrol.
I'm not too sure what the answer is to that, and I don't think the Treasury know either. What I have done is I've kind of speculated on that in another episode of Plug Live Television, What Barriers Balancing the Books, where I talk about how we could obtain revenue from electric vehicles. I reckon we're probably going to see a pay per mile setup, and that would apply to any vehicle, but for electric vehicles, the tax would be less than for petrol or diesel until the last internal combustion engine's off the road. And that would, that would mean that the mileage would be checked at every MOT, and then that would be fed to the Treasury, who would then issue you with your tax bill accordingly. Because if you were to put a tax on the electricity itself, then what you would find is that people would stop using, charge points, commercial charge points, or even home wall boxes with the SIM cards built in, and they would use the 3-pin plug to plug in, just run the cable out there through the window and, leave a 3-bar heater sitting next to that socket, and then say when the tax man comes a knocking, prove I just didn't have my heating on the whole time. So, I think it's going to be pay per mile, I reckon. When that's going to happen, I'm not too sure, but at some point before 2030. But yeah, I as I say, I kind of have a few postulations about it in that Plug Life episode, Balancing the Books.
Here's another question from Rob Barry. I don't know whether so his question is, do you know, Euan, if anybody's working on more environmental tires? So various things in terms of air quality and air pollution. It's not just from hydrocarbons that we're getting pollution. It's from brake dust, tire dust, etc. So environmental tires.
Yeah, I'm aware of a company called Nokian that has a winter tire that's quite popular with Tesla drivers, and I'm sure that they'll do other tire sizes and things that will be appropriate for other vehicles. But they proudly say on their website that they have a blend of natural materials as well as some synthetic in there. So there's a greater chance of it decomposing, and there's a greater chance of it being decomposable when those little marbles of rubber eventually do come off the tires. Yeah, it is obviously a pollution issue that needs to be looked into, because tires on any vehicle, including the humble push bike, the rubber from them will eventually get washed into the drain and out to sea and so on. So I think there's a two-pronged approach, and it's going to be looking for materials that will ultimately biodegrade and looking for filters in greater filters in or filtration in sewage systems and so on, to make sure that we catch all of this before it gets washed out to sea. But yeah, there no doubt will be more research groups and more innovative companies who are really pushing for this kind of stuff. But whether by accident or by design, Nokian is one that is looking into greater, more kind of sustainable use of materials, at least.
Thank you. So 6 minutes to go. If anybody's got any other questions to ask, there was one that sprung to my mind, which has just vanished. John, have you anything else to ask Euan while I look through my notes?
Well, I've got a question about maximum ranges on a typical sized car battery. I just wonder whether there's a theoretical maximum for a typical car battery size that we're using at the moment.
That's a good question, and it depends on numerous factors, because the chemistries are evolving so much, so quickly, that there are such improvements in the energy density there, and different chemistries coming in. It would be difficult to put a figure on that. But I mean, at the moment, what we've generally seen in terms of improvements in range is greater efficiency of packing the actual electrode material that's taking part in this chemical reaction, or facilitating this chemical reaction, into the same physical volume of battery space. So if you look at the battery in my 24 kilowatt hour Leaf, then it was actually quite spaced out. There was quite a lot of empty voids between the battery modules, whereas a modern battery pack, or one that's been designed from the ground up for maximum energy density, like a Tesla battery pack, is like a skateboard underneath the vehicle, and it's just really jam-packed with cells. But then inside those cells, the non-active materials, the separator between the electrodes that stops them electrically touching but allows lithium ions through, that's being made thinner. The current collector, so the actual metals that the active electrode material gets pasted onto to allow electrons in and out of the cell, that's being made thinner. Things like that. So that's how we've seen an increase in energy density. I mean, you can put a theoretical maximum on it if you were to say this battery would only be made of electrode material, but then it wouldn't work because obviously you need the other bits and pieces to allow the system to work as a whole. But I mean, we're already seeing electric vehicles being launched with well in excess of 400-mile range, and that's only going to continue to improve. I mean, we're already at a stage where premium electric vehicles are exceeding the kind of range of their internal combustion engine counterparts that are designed with like ridiculously big, massive, flashy V8 whatever engines and a modest fuel tank. So yeah, I doubt that range is going to be an issue. In terms of an absolute maximum range, if we get solid state on the go, then we could realistically be pushing 600, 700, 800, maybe even 1,000 miles per charge out of an EV. But that said, who really needs that? Because, there's one thing about having range anxiety with an electric car, but actually you quickly find that it's bladder anxiety. You find that a modern electric car, you need to stop before it does. And it makes perfect sense to plug that car into a high power charger, Tesla supercharger or an Ionity charger or something like that, run into the service station, and to go for a whiz, and then by the time you come back out, having grabbed a sandwich and all of that, the car is almost done and it's ready to go. So you've actually saved time, although the car has physically taken longer to fill than it would have if you were filling it with petrol. You've spent less time actually filling it because you don't need to then go and queue at the petrol station, fill up at the petrol station, pay at the petrol station. You've done all that whilst the car was parked. You've only spent seconds of your time charging it.
Great. Euan, thank you very much indeed. We're nearly at the end of time. John, do you want to do the so to speak, the wind up?
Yeah, fine. Yeah. So I mean, it's been a great talk, Euan. I'd like to close the meeting by thanking George for chairing it today. I think you've done a great job there, George, and to all the residents who have tuned in and offered questions to our speakers. It will be recorded, and it is being recorded, and it will be available on the Kenilworth Town Council website. I'd like to thank Neil Eaton, the Deputy Town Clerk, who's worked behind the scenes to set up our Cisco WebEx system. And Euan, thanks again for taking the time out to talk to us about EVs. It's been fascinating. It's been a great talk.
Thank you.
I just want to finish by reminding local residents that there is a Facebook page to support this talk. It's the Kenilworth Electric Vehicles Group, which Euan mentioned. And it's a mix of discussion, news and views about EVs, whether you're an owner or not. And so I just hope that we're able to continue the discussion of all these matters with people on that Facebook page. But for now, thanks to everybody for attending, and goodbye.